Action! Welcome back to another edition of Kudo Camera Company live stream. Today we're going to talk a bit about full frame mirrorless cameras versus APS-C and just crop sensors in general, and we'll talk about the differences and discuss if it really matters or not. So I'm just going to give you one perspective on this. You could talk about it for hours. But I want to talk specifically about lens selection and lens availability. So for me, I do have Sony a7II full frame mirrorless camera. It's absolutely beautiful. And at the same time, I have Sony NEX-3. I also have Sony NEX-5. So there's a few differences between these two cameras. One of the biggest differences is that I got this one used for about $100 and this one was used for about $750, which was actually a great deal. So the number one thing off the bat is the price. So before we talk about any of this, let me just say, if you're new to photography and you want to get into it, or you want to try mirrorless cameras for the first time, do not hesitate to get yourself one of these Sony mirrorless cameras. Look how small it is. Compared to the full frame camera, there's a huge size difference. But whatever I say about this, I own two of these, plus I own an Olympus Micro Four Thirds. I have three Olympus Micro Four Thirds cameras. So plus I have this stuff and EOS, Canon EOS. So whatever it is, we're just going to talk about APS-C versus full frame and talk about some of the differences. So my perspective on this is it's all about the lens selection. So for me, that's why one of the great things about having a full frame camera. So what do I mean about lens selection? So mostly, I don't have notes prepared, but today I do have a few notes that I just want to bring up. So the full frame sensor size is approximately 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters, or 35 millimeters by 24 millimeters. And for common APS-C, at least for DSLR, is 22 millimeters by 15 millimeters. So, we're talking about a sensor this size versus approximately a sensor that size. So this means that the full frame sensor has 2.5 times more surface area than APS-C. So that's talking about the surface area, which is different than the crop factor. So if you know about full frame versus APS-C, one of the things you talk about all the time are the crop factor. So the crop factor works that on a lens that is on your full frame camera, let's say it's a 50 millimeter lens, what you see in your field of view on your full frame is going to say it's going to be like this when you're looking here. When you're on your crop sensor, it's going to be like this. So it's going to make it look like it's equivalent 1.5 times whatever your focal length is. So I made a chart here, and actually we can switch over to the chart. Let's see how in focus we can get this for you. So full frame lens, and what does APS-C see? I could have done this as a graphic, but we're keeping it casual on Casual Friday here. So let's talk about that 50 millimeter lens. So over here, 50 millimeter lens on your APS-C, you're seeing a 75 millimeter equivalent. Or if you were fortunate enough to own an 85 millimeter lens, one of the most sought after lenses, that's going to be equivalent on your APS-C that you're seeing 127 millimeter. So now when you get down into some of the wider lenses, now you say, let's just look at the 18 millimeter. So if you're talking about a vintage 18 millimeter prime lens, what you're going to see when you put that on your APS-C is going to be equivalent to a 27 millimeter, which is very close, of course, to a 28 millimeter. So when it comes to standard lenses, you've got a few that are very standard. So here are a couple here. You've got your 50 millimeter. This is the most standard lens that there is. A 50 millimeter is easy to get and it's affordable. The second lens that's most common in my opinion, is the 28mm lens. It's readily available. So when you're a photographer and you want to achieve the look of a 50mm, you want to achieve the look of a 28mm. When you're purchasing for full frame and you're shopping for vintage lenses, this is sort of the crux of my argument here, just so you know we're kind of getting at it here. I'm not a debater, so I'm not really forming this properly. But when you're looking for a 28mm field of view, you're going to get better deals on a 28mm lens that actually shows 28mm on your viewfinder. So why does that matter? Because when you go to the train station and you want to shoot a wide angle shot, if you own a 28mm lens, you're going to get a pretty wide view, a pretty wide field of view with your 28mm. But when you take this 28mm and you put it on your APS-C sensor, you're going to end up with a 42mm field of view. So now we're talking about, instead of seeing a nice wide angle shot, you're actually going to be seeing kind of a it's not a quite portrait range, but it's no longer a wide angle. And in order to just get back to that 28mm, you're going to have to go out and buy yourself an 18mm prime lens to achieve that. The other drawback that I see is that when you're using an 18mm lens on an APS-C camera, you're going to have all that fisheye distortion, all that circular distortion that you know you get with an 18mm lens. That's going to be introduced into your shot. So for me, that's a drawback. The cool thing about a 28mm, a 35mm, they're wide, but they don't distort people. They don't make you look, like round lines on the edge of the shot and everything. So, when you have an 18mm lens, you're going to end up seeing quite a bit of distortion. So, likewise, if you end up with a 50mm lens and you want to be able to take sort of that street photography, that's just what it's for, for those sceneries. Now you've got an 75. So that ends up being like a portrait lens, basically. So that's kind of a drawback for me. So let's just talk a little bit more about what this means. So it's not always just about the performance. So it's one thing to say, okay, well, a 28mm lens is going to look like a 50mm lens. I can adjust to that. But the big thing is the price. So I can't exactly say it's a bell curve. It's not really a bell curve, but let's just look at one half of it. The 28mm lenses, so the 50mm is the most common, and they're the least expensive because they're the most common. All other things being equal, there's obviously so many different factors that go into a price of a lens. But the thing is, the 50mm is the most common, it's the most mass produced, so therefore it's going to be the most affordable, the cheapest to buy. Now you've got your 28mm lens. There are just slightly fewer produced, and so they're a little bit more expensive, but they're not a ton more expensive. In between them, even though there's the 35mm lens, they were even more rare than the 28mm. So there's a slight fluctuation there between the two, but for the most part, let's just say 50mm to 28mm, both very affordable. But then once you get to the 24mm, you see a huge spike in price. So between a 28mm prime and a 24mm prime, you see a huge jump. It's only a few degrees difference on what you're seeing, but the thing is, there were so many fewer made that the price is just going to be a huge difference there. And then when you go down to an 18mm or a 15mm prime lens, forget about it. The price is going to be easily double or triple what you would be paying for the equivalent. So just in this case, if you were to get a 18mm prime lens, that's going to run you, let's just say for a vintage run-of-the-mill, it's going to be at least probably $200. Whereas for a 28mm run-of-the-mill, the basic one is going to cost you maybe $40 or $50. So I'm not saying this as a way to justify purchasing the a7II versus the NEX. It's not really, you can find a number of different ways to rationalize that. But the thing is, just to know that when you are going out to purchase your glass, you're going to be up against those barriers. So for a long time, I had the NEX-3 and I loved it. I had a ton of fun with it over the years, and it was a great camera. It's really small. It helped me get into mirrorless and see if I was interested in it or not. It's a great camera all around. And it took me a while to kind of build up the nerve to, spend the $700 to get this camera. The good thing is it's held its value, I'm sure. But it's not for sale. So, I love this lens. But now when I put on a 28 millimeter and I look through, I get the 28 millimeter field of view. I have the lens performing the way that it was intended. There's so many other arguments that you can get into for image quality, or the quality of the large sensor. Some of the vintage lens fanatics will say, oh, well, to really experience the lens, you don't want to just be looking through a little piece in the center. You need to see the whole thing, and the edges have so much character and everything. Well, there's all those arguments to be made as well, but for me it kind of comes down to being a bit of a rationalist on it, where if you want to go through and get all your different lenses, you're going to be able to get 50 millimeter lenses all day, and it has a specific purpose. But once you want to get that 28 millimeter field of view, or of course if you want to go even wider than that, using an APS-C, it's going to be more expensive from that perspective. So keep it in mind. I'd love to know what you think, so please comment below. And as always, check us out on eBay at Kudo Camera Company. You can visit us on our website and get to our eBay store and our Amazon store. Find us on Facebook as well as Instagram, and of course YouTube. So please do subscribe. We're trying to get to 100 subscribers, and we'll be able to grab our custom URL. So look forward to doing that with your support. And I hope you're having a great day, and look forward to hearing from you. So take care.